Hello again and welcome to another episode of the Franchise Everything podcast where we talk about everything and anything franchising. And today we are very privileged. You probably hear it said often about being in the presence of franchise royalty, but we certainly are with Stephen Penfold, who is the founder of Kwik Kopy Australia. G'day, Stephen. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much for joining us today on this. This is been a long time coming, this chat we were going to have. We've talked about it for some time, I believe, because we've spoken to a lot of Kwik Kopy franchise owners and team members there. How are things going?
Good.
Yeah. Excellent. So we're going to tell your story. So now, for those who don't know, you are a foundational Hall of Famer with the Franchise Council of Australia. So you were number one or number two entered into the Hall of Fame. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes. Yeah. And when was that? Casting your mind back?
Probably about 83 or 84.
Very
because we started in 81. It would have been 87.
Yep.
I took over. I bought the Kwik Kopy franchise in 85, and
goes way back.
I've got it all mucked up.
It's all the balance. We'll get to that anyway.
Yeah,
we'll get to the FCA stuff anyway because and I know why it's a little bit thing because before this we talk about all sorts of things and we've been chucking around dates all over the place. So now we're going to start back with a very unique story and a unique start to Kwik Kopy, to where you are right now as Kwik Kopy. But you've got this whole business has got some Convict origins way back. Can you tell the story from right at the start there so people can get a picture? I think many people would realise just the extensive history that the brand or the business as we know it now has in the Australian marketplace. Can you kick it off?
Yeah, sure. The family have only been involved, the Penfold family have been involved in the printing industry since the early 1880s. Mm-hmm. But the original business that they bought was started by a convict called William Moffat, who was sent to this country for stealing tea in Scotland. And in the 1829, the then governor discovered that he didn't have a bookbinder in the colony. And
William Moffat had that qualification.
William Moffat was a bookbinder,
yep.
And so he let William Moffat out of jail early, and William Moffat, so that he could bind the books.
Great trade.
He started a business called William Moffat and Company that was a printer and stationer in 1830. He subsequently sold that to a friend, Thomas Yeo, who ran it until the 1880s. And by the 1880s, Thomas Yeo had a close friend called Edwin Penfold, who had come to the country.
That's where that Penfold name comes in.
That's the first entrance of the Penfold name.
Yeah.
And Edwin had come to Australia in the 1830s to try and find gold. Was unsuccessful in finding gold, but built a fine business in tobacco, selling tobacconists as a tobacconist. And he and Thomas Yeo were close friends. Edwin had two sons, Will and Fred. In the late 1870s, Will went off to do an apprenticeship in the printing industry with a local printer in Sydney. Mm-hmm. And when he finished his apprenticeship in the early 80s, he said, "Dad, your friend Thomas Yeo wants to sell his printing business, and I wouldn't mind buying it. Can you lend me £4,000 to buy the business?"
It's quite a bit of money in those days,
Quite
no
a
doubt.
lot of money in those days. So Dad said, "Yep, sure, I'll lend you the money, but I want you to take your young brother Fred in, who had just finished architecture." And the two boys, Fred and Will, were lent the money by Dad, started the business, and that was the beginning of the Penfold ownership of that business that had started in 1830.
So did they rebranded the name of that too?
They changed the name to W.C. Penfold and Company.
Okay.
And traded under that name until eventually my father, who was Fred's son.
Everyone didn't realise it was going to be an Ancestry.com.
Exactly. My father and his brother took the company public in the 50s as a public company and listed it on the stock exchange in Sydney.
So what were they doing up to that time? So that time, once they had W.C. Penfold from the 1880s to the 1950s, what were their main product offering to the marketplace?
Everything. They were general commercial printers.
Yep.
and they had multiple factories. They were doing packaging. They were doing all sorts of commercial printing. Will, who was the senior partner, was a great friend of the then writers. I mean, they published books for May Gibbs.
Yes.
They
great Australian authors, no doubt, would have come
great
through.
Australian authors, and
so they were based in Sydney. That was when
they were based in Sydney.
Yeah,
and all their customer list included, way back in the 1800s, before they bought the business, the David Jones of this world and the then Bank of New South Wales.
Wow. So an incredible Australian,
Australian historic piece of history. Yeah.
So okay, so this is the 50s, and it's a public company at this stage.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So where do you come in? Where's your involvement in, and you start coming into the business with your father?
Edwin and his Fred and Will had a bunch of children. Mm-hmm. Fred had 2 sons, Edwin and Norman, being 2 of them. Mm-hmm. And Will had a son, Bill, sorry. Those 3 ran the business, but Bill retired early. Edwin and Norman went on a similar trip to the trip I later took, which took me overseas to get my grounding in the printing industry. But they ran the business through from pretty much straight after the First World War until the late 50s, early 60s. They continued it as a general printer. So they hadn't focused it on any particular aspect of printing. They had a stationery store in Pitt Street, WC Penfolds at 88 Pitt Street. They had a factory behind Pitt Street. They owned the building in Hosking House behind.
There's some real estate there.
Yeah, the beautiful real estate.
Yeah.
And they had built a factory in Surrey Hills in the late 30s. But the business was still a typical commercial printer.
Yeah, for all types of clients.
It did everything for all types of clients.
Okay.
They had one stationery store, and it was a big, diverse range of product. Yeah.
So when did the transition start happening? So you came into the business. So you were saying you went to London to do
my cousin
apprenticeship in printing.
Yeah. Norman had a son called Will. Mm-hmm. Edwin had a son called Stephen.
That's you. Yeah.
We were both about the same age. Will was a year older than I am. We joined. He went off and did accounting. I went off as a dog's body in a printing factory in Sydney as a labourer, and worked my way around all the departments of the printing factory in those days.
Sounds very Packeresque.
Oh, yeah. And in those days, of course, the printing industry had, I think there were 13 or 14 trades. Wow. And each of those trades took 4 years. It was a complex...
So you could really specialise in one thing.
Well, you couldn't cross trades. It was very union controlled, couldn't cross trades. And I went off and spent a year and a half, 2 years as a dog's body, as a labourer, working in another printing factory in each of those trades.
Did you enjoy that?
Yes, I loved it.
Yeah. What was the part you loved about it most? You didn't want to get into the more corporate part of the business at that time?
No, I was busy. I'd always loved playing with machines and building things, and I just enjoyed the all aspects of it.
So is it mainly the equipment and stuff that you like setting, or because it's a very different printing process than it is now, obviously, isn't it?
Totally
I don't think people would realise the difference.
You have no idea.
Yeah.
Let me transgress a moment.
Yeah, that's all right.
When I finally got back to Penfolds, which was in the 1961, so I spent the 50s learning, if you want, learning my trade, of which 2 or 3 years were spent at the London School of Printing, which took me through all the trades again, but also through the management aspects of the printing industry, as my cousin did the same thing. And then I spent a year and a half in England learning a specific trade about rotogravure printing, which was used for...
what?
Rotogravure printing, which was used for flexible packaging, which was new to Australia, relatively new to Australia. And I spent 2 years working as a printer in factories across England.
So this is the early 60s, and what's...
No, it's the late 50s.
Late 50s. What's flexible packaging? Can you describe it?
It takes materials like aluminium foil and cellophane and polyethylene and prints them in continuous roll form, so that the rolls, when they're completed, are then taken off and put onto a roll-fed packaging machine where your customers wrap their biscuits. And the machine takes a roll of cellophane, pulls it out, wraps the biscuits, cuts it off, and that's that.
And that was you.
I mean, if you go back 10 years prior to that, or 5 years prior to that, if you wanted biscuits, you didn't buy a packet of biscuits in a cellophane wrap. You went to the local grocery store, and the grocery store had a jar with biscuits in it and paper bags, and you bought a pound of biscuits.
So that the printing...
That evolution happened in the 40s
stable
and 50s.
foods and so on, really.
Yes, yes.
Wow. So that's the late 50s. You're in London, you're doing that sort of stuff, you're doing those apprenticeships and learning more about management side to it. So into the early 60s and everything, what was your progression through the business from there in Penfolds?
I came back to
management?
I came back to Australia and started a division of WC Penfolds called Flexible Packaging.
Taking all that knowledge that you learned.
And in fact, the equipment that we bought, the company our fathers had just taken the company public, and the equipment that we bought nearly doubled the equity that we had in the company. It was a big step for WC Penfolds to go into flexible packaging.
So it was that equipment investment?
That equipment investment and the investment of getting it started and trained. It was a big step by WC Penfolds, and they did it because they saw the future, and our fathers had great faith.
So were others in Australia doing that and investing in that type of stuff
There were.
at the moment? Or were you guys
there were
mainly
two other
leading the way?
companies, Gadsden and two other companies doing it, but I had only been doing it for a few years.
Okay, so it's fairly new technology.
It was relatively new, yeah.
Okay. All right, so how long did you stay in the packaging, that flexible packaging for?
About 10 years.
And you enjoyed your time there, no doubt? You didn't try and push to get out of that and move into anything else considering your family owned the business?
No, I loved it. I was learning. I learnt my first lesson about that stayed with me all through my career, that the lesson that the business owner in a printing company is the key to building the relationships that you need to have a successful company. The building of relationships of trust with your customers is the key to the success of a printer, not your equipment, not your machinery.
Yeah, it's not all about the equipment.
It's all about the relationship between the owner of the business and the customers.
It's interesting. We talk about that quite a bit, and everyone I've spoken to, Kwik Kopy, franchise owners we've spoken to, talk about their focus on relationships with their customers.
And that was such a crucial, that was a very early and crucial learning exercise for me.
Yeah.
Penfolds, my cousin was my boss and my chairman. We then joined the board in the late 60s, and my father, who was the chairman at that time, retired. And my cousin and I then ran the public company for the next, until 1985.
What was it like running a public company?
Oh, interesting and difficult.
Yeah, stressful.
It was
stressful.
Fun. So no, it was good.
Yeah,
loved it, and we were very successful.
Yeah,
but at the end of the during the 60s, we decided that the printing industry we liked the idea of profit centres. We liked the idea of having small divisions of the company that specialised under a person that felt they owned it. They were the owner. And we bought a number of independent printers because they were specialists, and their owners stayed on in the business that we bought.
So was that because of your thought process around that relationship with customers was crucial?
It was all built around that.
Yeah.
A conglomerate printer, general printer, was too focused on its machinery. We wanted a business that was focused on the owner and the customers specialising in a particular product. And in that period, we in the years of the 60s, we changed the nature of Penfolds from a general printer to a bunch of specialist printers.
Yes.
Each with its own chief executive who knew their customers and dealt with their customers.
So did you diversify the work then at that stage that you were taking in from customers and then putting that out to different areas, were you, for specialists?
They had the job of running the company, their own specialist business. So each chief executive had his specialist company. He had to develop his own customers. We didn't have a central selling core. They were all little profit centres. At the end of the 60s, we had one stationery store, and the guy that had been running that for many years, it was a substantial part of the business still, and he retired. And my cousin said, "You want a bit of a change? Why don't you see what you can do with stationery?" So I left. I passed on my flexible packaging business to one of our other employees who took it on as the chief executive.
Yes.
And I moved into the stationery part of the business. In the 70s and up till the early 80s, that I was focused on that.
So what was key about the stationery business that you saw in growing? What were you thinking about growing it? Were you wanting to grow locations, or were you just wanting to grow sales? Because it had one store, did you say, at that time in Sydney?
We had one store in Pitt Street in Sydney.
Yep.
We had a second store at that time called R.T. Kelly's in Castle Row Street. It was a tiny little store. It had been part of another company that we had bought, R.T. Kelly's.
Yes.
And the goal was to build sales by opening more outlets. That era was the beginning of the computerisation of stocks, computerisation of debtors and creditors. So it was a bit of an evolutionary period too.
Fast growth, fast change.
Very. And in trying to understand how that could best be done and what good looked like, I couldn't find people in the industry in Australia that were willing to compare notes with me. Don't like it. So I found three US...
So you're saying they weren't very collegiate? They didn't want to compare notes about the way that their business was running?
Everybody tends to think it...
Pretty silo?
Yeah. It's pretty silly, but that's the way the world works. So I recruited three stationery companies in the US, one in Canada, one in the UK, and one in New Zealand, and suggested to the owners of those that we should meet once a year in a location somewhere around the world with our wives and benchmark, lay our profit and loss and balance sheet on the table.
And try and learn from each other.
Yeah. They all thought that was a pretty good idea.
Yep.
And all through those 10 years of the 70s and the early years of the 80s, I used to head off once a year for a world trip to see what was happening, looking at print as well as looking at everything that Penfolds were doing, but benchmarking.
So what did you take from that? So to encapsulate that decade of doing that, what were some of the key learnings you got out of it and brought back to the Australian market? Did you find doing that got you ahead of the game for your competitors?
Yes, to answer that question, absolutely. And it taught me, it reinforced my belief that you've got to have trust from customers, and that's got to be a key to everything. Because the stationery industry, like the printing industry prior to that, had been driven by price. Everybody wanted to be able to produce cheaper than the next guy. I learned early in the flexible packaging business that cheap didn't matter. If your customer wanted a product that fed through his flexible packing machines properly, I, as his printer, needed to understand his business. I learned that little lesson in Tasmania when I went to a dairy farmer to sell my flexible packaging wrapping for butter. And I spent the first half hour in the dairy farm on the top of Tasmania trying to tell this guy about my super duper printing machinery, and realised halfway through that his eyes had gone boom. He really wasn't interested.
Doesn't care.
And I went away and I went back the next morning and started talking to him about his cows and his packing machine and his dairies. And his eyes lit up and he became a firm customer. And next time he had a problem in his, and he wanted a redesign of his packaging material, he rang me and said, help.
So it wasn't a price issue.
And price was no longer part. Benchmarking, that was the biggest benefit. We all learned. A lot of those stationers, in America in particular, thought that they had to sell cheaper than anybody else. And the cost of goods in their businesses were at the 60% mark. the cost of goods in the Penfold stationery stores were in the high 40s. We were making 15 cents more on the bottom line than they were. And they said, how do you do it? And then we all sat down and analysed it, and we did it because of product range. And that's what the successful retailers today are doing. I mean, the Bunnings of this world don't really sell cheap. They have a massive, wonderful product range. And
with great supply chains.
And great supply chains, and they deliver well. Yeah. So that was a core lesson of the stationery industry.
So how did you progress on from there? So you did that for about 10 years, and what did it look like and the impact in the stationery industry from those one or two stores?
By the time we got to the 80s, when I when I bought Kwik Kopy, we had, I think, about 21 stationery stores, and we had, I can't remember what our sales were. They were 8 or 9 times more than they had been 10 years earlier. And it's pity, because in looking back, Penfold stationers should have been Bunnings.
I was going to say, you could have been Officeworks.
It should have been Officeworks, yes. Sorry, Officeworks.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean.
Absolutely. Yeah. However, Kosara.
That's right. You've got Kwik Kopy.
Yeah.
So how did you progress from there?
In the late 70s, one of my co-directors on the board of WC Penfolds, who was a printer, went to America and saw Kwik printing. That had started because of a change in technology that allowed cheap, quick printing.
Which was never a thing.
Never been available before. And while it was pretty crude and pretty fundamental, it had a wonderful slot in the market.
So it was still game-changing for many businesses, wasn't it? Yeah.
And he came back and said we should open some quick print shops. I was running the stationery business. There was a commonality in the customers. The customers that wanted business stationery wanted short-run printing. So we located the 5 hotspot printing shops. We started them as Hotspot in 1979.
They're called Hotspot? Yeah.
Hotspot.
Yep.
And we started them in the back of existing Penfold stores. And he ran them. And he then retired. And I inherited 5 Hotspot in my stores. And we couldn't make any money out of them.
I picture it almost like a photo lab in the back of chemists and those sorts of stores there. It's similar sort of styling.
Yeah, it's what Officeworks have now.
Yeah.
It's exactly what Officeworks. A little printing, a couple of machines, a couple of desks, a couple of people in the back of the stationery store.
So you're about 40 years ahead of your time.
Yeah. But it didn't work.
No. Why didn't it work?
The investment was probably $15,000. It was hardly anything. Yep. The equipment was nothing. And when we had an operator, a manager who understood that his job was dealing with the customers, we made a fortune. And most of those only stayed for a year, and then they saw, why aren't I doing this for myself?
Because the barriers to entry were quite low.
The entry level cost us so low.
Yeah.
So all our good managers left, and we were left with the lousy managers, and we didn't make any money.
So did they even start their own businesses to compete with you?
Yeah. Few of them succeeded because they didn't have the breadth of knowledge about running a business. So I inherited it. I went on one of my benchmarking stationery trips around the world, thinking I need to find out who's doing this properly where, and find out if they'll teach me how to do it. And in London, I met an Israeli called Moshe Gerstenhaber, who had the year before or 2 years before, he started opening stores under a franchise from an American company called Kwik Kopy. And he called it Call Kwik in London because they couldn't register the brand Kwik Kopy. And I said to Moshe, how are you doing it? And Moshe said, I've hardly been here for 20 minutes. Why don't you call in and see the guy that I bought it from? I'm sure he'd like a licensee in Australia. And he introduced me to Bud Hadfield.
Yep.
I went to America, to Houston, where Kwik Kopy was located.
And what year was this?
1981. 1980.
Yep.
And met Bud. He had 700 franchises in America. He'd been going for about 5 years. He had Moshe in London, who had about 40 or so, or 50, I can't remember the numbers. And he had just recruited a Canadian called Kent Harding, who had opened up Kwik Kopy in Canada. And Bud was an extraordinary character. He was a personality of depth.
Of epic proportions.
Of epic proportions. He was also, interestingly, a Dale Carnegie trainer. He had been a little printer, and to fill his time, he had joined Dale Carnegie and became one of their senior trainers in America before he started Kwik Kopy. And he took the Dale Carnegie techniques into Kwik Kopy. And I met a man who understood exactly what I knew about the need for relationship building in the printing industry.
So what are the key things, to sum up for those who don't know, what are the key things to take out of the Dale Carnegie approach as far as running a business like that?
Let me explain what the difference was to the way he was running his print shops and the rest of the industry was. The rest of the industry who were franchised, and there was one in Australia called Snap who had already opened a lot of little stores that were self-managed and had just started franchising when I got back. And they taught their store managers or their franchisees to run the print press. And they recruited couples and they said, the husband, you run the print press, wife, you tend the counter. We as a corporate entity, as a franchisor, will market your product and drive customers into your shop. Under the Bud principle, under the Dale Carnegie principle, it's the other way around. We employ a printer to run the printing press. If the wife or the husband want to attend the counter, by all means, but the key person in the business, the owner, has got to be the salesperson and doesn't wait for the customers to be driven in the door, goes out and finds the customers and wins their confidence and their trust to build a business that's based on relationships with trust.
And that fits right into your approach. And that fits into your approach on business as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I walked into his doors.
I can see why you gelled.
I walked into his doors, listened to this and thought, you got me. Interestingly, in the first 15 years, I suppose, we sent all our franchisees to America for a month to be trained. After they decided to open while we were preparing their stall for them, they'd go off to America, husband and wife, and go through a month of training. And 2/3 of that training was Dale Carnegie. It had very
Rather
little
than the actual printing skills or anything.
Very little to do with the printing presses.
Wow.
It was Dale Carnegie and bookkeeping and accounting. And
so what was your impression of the Kwik Kopy business at that time? I mean, it must have been an exciting thing to see that. When you got there to Bud and it was like you had 700 stores, you must have been pretty pumped up to see it.
It was immensely exciting. And I mean, the customer base of the printing industry had never had somebody walking in the door and saying, yeah, we can do it today.
Yeah, something really customer service oriented, something dynamic.
Absolutely.
Can-do attitude.
And the printing industry had, because of the cost of preparation and the time that it took to prepare the printing surfaces, print jobs, you couldn't produce a quick, short job. It was essentially a long process. And because it was a long process, and the equipment that you ran the jobs on was so expensive, to be effective in the industry, you had to run on shifts. And if you run on shifts, you can't offer quick timelines. If you are committed to 2 or 3 groups of people coming in every day to run 3 shifts, you can't wonder if you're going to have work for them tomorrow.
Yeah, and that labour component must be high as well on that. Yeah.
So it's a whole different philosophy in the way you manage a business.
So, okay, the transition or expanding it into the Australian market. So what was your approach and your thinking behind Australia? How many sites did you think were possible, or how did you approach bringing the brand into Australia from that 1981
We used all the experience that the Americans and the Canadians and the British had in how do we locate, where do we locate, how do we measure the site, That's been revised many times since, so it's not the way it was in the early days as markets change.
Yep.
Bud and the Canadians and the Brits had done a lot of this sort of research and development, and all I had to do was benchmark, follow along, use the best.
Yep. Follow the proven principles.
Yeah, there was a lot of the stuff that we didn't use because it wasn't the best. It was obviously not the best. But it was a pretty easy head start. So we started we started advertising in 1981.
For franchise owners?
Yeah, for franchise owners.
Did you know anything about franchising then?
Nobody in our organisation knew about franchising. And it was very new.
Yeah.
Very new.
Yeah, I bet.
So we started in...
your chuckle there, you must think, there must be a few stories there.
It was just... It was a new industry. I mean,
I bet.
People of my generation will remember the only franchise at the time was run by a woman, and it was called Nitwit. And she made patterns for ladies to buy the patterns and then make dresses and clothes for their children on their sewing machines. And she had franchised Nitwit.
Oh, wow.
McDonald's had come to Australia.
I was going to say McDonald's there.
Kentucky Chicken were here, as were Pizza Hut.
Yes.
And but it was a brand new industry.
I think people can't really get their head around what 1980 Australia looks like from a food retail and many other retail service offers than it is right now.
Yeah.
And that's what franchising has brought.
Exactly. And so I had recruited an ex-franchisee from Dallas and his wife to come out to Australia as the chief executive to get us going.
Yep.
And we had a little board that I chaired, and he recruited our first half dozen employees, and we set out and
you're off and running,
trying to find franchisees.
So what did that growth look like? What did the development
look
like?
Well, it stopped
first
there.
Few years?
The year we advertised in 81, found our first franchisee, who, as it happened, was my brother-in-law.
Yep. It's a great start. Yep.
Great start.
It's often the first start, isn't it?
Not a good way.
No, isn't it?
No. Well, as it happened, it was. But and as we ran our first ads in November of 81, and in January or February of 82, the New South Wales government brought in a change of law that said that if you were selling franchises, the person selling the franchises had to be qualified as a stockbroker, have the same qualifications as a stockbroker.
Makes a lot of sense.
To make sure that there weren't crooks in the business. And so that stopped us dead in the water because our salesperson and the new chief executive and I, all of who could be considered to be salespeople, we weren't qualified as stockbrokers.
So how did you fix that?
The government, the New South Wales government, served us on a notice to say, we're going to prevent you from advertising and we'll sue you if you do, unless you meet our qualifications. And when I went to them, they said, we picked you because you're a public company and you're highly reputable and you have a long reputation in the business world.
So you're a great scapegoat.
And we thought you'd be a great example to pick on to set a precedent.
Send a message to everyone else. Yeah.
So it was all fairly quickly got over, but they got the message across.
Yeah.
That interest by the government and the franchise sector, which has never ceased to be there,
absolutely to this day,
progressed in the following years to the point where the federal government got involved, and they appointed Alan Fells as a consultant to suggest to them what legislation should be brought forward to control the franchising industry.
Yes.
And Alan Fells sought an advisory group for that group, and I was one of that advisory group.
This is very early on in the establishment of
franchising
very structure in
on.
Australia.
And and either immediately before that or immediately after that, the guy running Pizza Hut, who was a fellow called Chris Levy, who I had sold to in Penfolds when he was buying for Nestle.
Buying packaging for Nestle for Kit Kats.
Yeah, so he and I had a long relationship.
Yeah.
And he rang me and said, we need to get the franchise of Australia together as an association so that we can respond to government.
Okay. So
we
some form of advocacy.
So we started the Franchise Association of Australia.
Yep.
And Kwik Kopy were number 2.
Yeah, and that's morphed since into the Franchise Council of Australia.
That morphed into the Franchise Council.
Excellent. So you were right at the beginnings, right at the foundations.
All that was in the background as we're trying frantically to make a quid in the business.
I was going to say, and you've actually got a business you're trying to grow at the same time, yet you're dealing with government, you're establishing an association, an organisation. So the growth of Kwik Kopy at that time, how did you get around it? So did you ever go and get a stockbroking licence?
No, we didn't have to.
You didn't need to?
Have to.
You got that sorted?
They wanted to make the point, and they wanted the rest of the industry to, the burgeoning industry to know that they were going to stick their bit in.
Serious. Yeah. So how was the growth then? What was the path?
Well, so we started it as a subsidiary of Kwik Kopy of WC Penfolds.
Yep. Of the stationery business.
Yeah, in 81 we opened our first franchise in 82.
Yep.
And by 85 we had, I think, about 14. And I think they were doing about $6 million in sales. And we had 1 in Brisbane, we had 2 in Melbourne, and the rest were in Sydney. None of them were making a great deal of money. You don't in the first year or two of franchising, and all of our owners were in their first 2 years.
Yes, just establishing their own marketplaces. Yeah.
And
so is that because they need their regular customers, their customers to come back and purchase more, and that as they just build up that
Well, the start
base?
out of a Kwik Kopy franchise is in the first, you've got to get, we as a franchisor have got to give them techniques that allow them to build a customer base in the first 3 or 4 months, so that in the first 3 or 4 months they can get to the point where they can draw money out of the business.
Yep.
They aren't living on savings.
Yes.
And that's crucial.
Absolutely.
And that was where we were 2 years later.
Yeah.
And I went off to, I happened to be in America with Bud Hadfield in January of 1985 or 86. And one of our franchisees approached my cousin, who was the chairman of the public company, and said he wasn't making any money. And in his second year, he still wasn't making enough money, and he was going to sue us for misleading.
Yep.
And I got a telephone call. I don't think even there were telexes in those days, not faxes. There were telex. I got a telex.
You got a telex, yeah.
From
at
my cousin
at your hotel.
Yeah, saying from my cousin, get home.
Yeah.
So I got home, and he said, I don't like franchising.
This is the chairman, your cousin.
My cousin.
Chairman, yep.
I don't like franchising. I don't like dealing with franchisees. They've got opinions of their own.
Yeah.
And they're not like employees that you tell what to do.
Yeah, he's probably not the guy for franchising now.
And I'm out.
Yep.
I want to sell this business. And I said, I think you're nuts. And he said, well, if you think I'm nuts, why don't you buy it?
The Kwik Kopy business. Yep.
So I went home and said to my wife, here's a proposition. And that evening, we were sitting by the pool in our home in Pymble, in our pajamas, in our second bottle of.
I've heard bits of this story. Yeah, go on.
Do you mind me telling it?
Yeah,
again?
go for it. I like it.
And our daughter Annalise arrived home from school. She was in her last year of school. Yeah. At sort of 9 o'clock, she'd been at a party or something, and saw us beside the pool and said, "What are you two doing?" And I said, "Oh, it's exciting, but we can't tell you yet." And she went off to school the next day and said to all her friends, I think my 48-year-old mum's having another baby. Terrible.
And as my response, obviously, to that was that, well, you sort of are having another baby, aren't you, being a franchise system?
We were.
Yeah.
And in fact, so I bought it in 86.
It must be a great memory.
Barb and I bought it.
Yeah.
And we bought a business that was losing $100,000 a year. And he had a corporate entity that could support 50 or 60, but was supporting 12, 14.
So So was it scary? Like how?
Yeah, it was scary, but it was fun.
So you bought the business from WC Penfolds.
Yep.
So you bought that. So how precarious was that for you for jumping in and doing that? Like what was the thought process behind it and the position you were actually in?
Well, I clearly understand the trauma that every franchisee that buys a Kwik Kopy goes through in those first years and months in their new Kwik Kopy.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Yeah.
It's traumatic. You don't have an income. You're spending more than you're getting in. You know where you want to go, but it just takes time.
You're trying to build that business.
And you've got to learn as you go. And it's traumatic. We conquered that. We got over the top of that hill in the first 2 years, I suppose.
Yep.
So by the third year, we had probably 60 franchises. I mean, in those days,
that's adding a lot of franchises in.
Well, franchising was new in Australia. Everybody wanted to buy a franchise. We had just gone through the 80s recession.
Yep.
And there were multitudes of people who had lost their jobs, but had big handouts from their employers.
And are looking for the next thing
and
to
they
do.
were looking for the next job, and they couldn't. The corporate world wasn't employing.
I was going to say, to go from 14 to 60 in about 2 to 3 years would be big numbers today.
It was a very easy market to recruit in. And we had this point of difference that our competitors were all still training husbands and wives to be printers and counter operators. And we were saying, no, this is a business. If you're going to buy one of these, we're not going to train you how to run a machine. You employ a printer. We're going to train
Total
you.
different philosophy, isn't it?
A totally different philosophy.
Yeah.
We're going to train you to go out and build relationships of trust.
So you want people to work on the business?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was a pretty easy market.
And the progression through there, so you grew it through and stepped out of the business at some point going forward. When did you start to look to move out of the business, and how did you approach that?
I didn't. My son, who you'll talk to in due course, I think, Matthew, he'll tell his own story, but he came back into the business in the early 90s, I think, or late 80s.
Yep.
And by that stage, he was a 30-year-old and had a bit of worldly experience behind him.
Yeah.
And he'll tell his own story about how he went through the learning process of the printing industry.
Yeah.
And he came into the business as our chief of operations, managing our support staff. And he did that for 10 years. And at that point, I stepped aside and he took over as Kwik Kopy CEO. I bought another franchise and snuggled it in beside Kwik Kopy called Sinewave.
Yep.
And we built that to 21 with me running that. But I was in semi-retirement mode, and it never really got the chief executive that it needed.
Yep.
We eventually sold it.
Yes.
It's now still there and working well.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we wrap this up, you're clearly a very passionate franchising person. You know, you're at the foremost, like the foundations of the Franchise Council.
I'm passionate about nearly everything.
Yeah, I know you are.
Yeah.
But we'll encapsulate franchising in this part of it. So, you know, as you know, so what do you love about franchising so much that you see for people to get into? Because you're obviously you're still involved as a family in Kwik Kopy and everything like that. I mean, your children are all involved. What do you see in franchising?
Well, I get my biggest kicks. We've got 100 odd franchisees now, a little under.
Yep.
Most of those franchisees are in the business for sort of 12, 14 years. Owning a franchise is hard work. It's very hands-on, and people, they get tired. So the average is 12, 14 years, and they move on.
That's pretty good, though. It's well above the industry average.
Yeah. So I was doing a mental check the other day. I think we've had about 280 people through the franchise system. We've had probably 5 failures, real failures, bankruptcy failures. They couldn't make it. They didn't make it, and of the 300 people that tried, probably 5 have failed. It makes nonsense of the government statistics about bad franchising is bad for business.
Yeah. When you compare to small business ownership.
Back to your question, I get my jollies because I look out there and I see 300 families that have built their own businesses because I created a franchise.
Must be enormously satisfying.
Yeah, terribly
and passing
satisfying.
on to the family as well.
Yeah, and I've known all of them individually.
Yes.
Husband and wife, a lot.
Which is rare for families.
In a lot of occasions,
franchises.
their children.
Yeah.
And I always remember walking at a conference that we had. My wife and I were walking, and the franchisees tend to, bellyache all the time. You've always
As
got.
we all do.
Yeah, it's part and parcel. And my wife and I were walking into the grand ballroom for the final night, and we were behind a group of franchisees, and there was a franchisee and his wife from Queensland, and with two other couples, and the guy was carrying on about Kwik Kopy Australia. And they do this and they don't do that, and they're this and they're that and they're the other. And Barb and I were sort of 3 paces behind them. He didn't realise. And his wife, halfway down the hall, stopped, and everybody stopped. And she turned to him and said, "Why don't you just shut up?" And he said, and she said, "You put 2 children through university because of this. You've got a 40-foot boat because of this. We travel the world every year because of this. And you're knocking it? Shut up." And Barb and I went, ah.
A great moment of satisfaction.
Yes. How do I get...
Did you chat to him?
No.
No, you just let him go.
He still doesn't know I ever heard it.
No, well, it's good. Good
But
thing you
I mean,
did.
how do I get my jollies? I get my jollies by watching all that happen.
Excellent. Beautiful way to finish it. Great story.
Okay, thank you.
Great, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us today, mate. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you. And that's it again for another episode of the Franchise Everything podcast. I hope you really enjoyed that one. Please do like, subscribe, share, tell everyone about it so we can do more stories just like this, and we'll catch you in the next one soon.